true that it's bad that John Lewis said that. I don't like what Stacey Abrams said.
Is he an election denier?
I would say yes. I would say that when we compare the
well, you're consistent then. I applaud you.
Thank you. I appreciate. Can I get an applause? Thank you very much. So, Michael, this is my first time talking to you. This is probably the first time a lot of my chat has listened to your voice. Most of them probably know you from Twitter. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Well, I don't know for sure. I'll introduce myself, but I'm sort of curious to hear you introduce yourself because I would only have been tangentially aware of you. Like I'm not going to be able to cite chapter and verse as to what your background is or what your story is. I know that you're, I guess, roughly speaking, in some kind of pro-Ukraine Twitter milieu, but maybe that's an oversimplification. So I'm just sort of would be curious to hear you just describe yourself in general terms. And if people who are watching this are in the same milieu, roughly speaking, they probably think that I'm like the embodiment of evil. So I guess I'll try to rebut that and just say that I disavow evil, I disavow devil worship, I disavow Voldemort and so on and so forth. I'm just kidding. I don't disavow those things. I embrace them.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm actually kidding there. Yeah, I'm a journalist. Since 2021, my primary platform has been Substack. When I migrated there, as Substack was expanding in that time period, before that, had written for publications across the political spectrum, right and left. So, started out The Nation magazine, wrote regularly for The American Conservative, Salon, Mother Jones, Daily Beast. I was a columnist for Vice for a while. I still occasionally write for the New York Daily News. I was a columnist. I wasn't a paid employee. I wasn't a full-time employee of Vice, but I just had like sort of a de facto title of columnist. So where I just wrote a piece for them every week or two. I mean, it's not nothing too fancy, but they did bestow me with that title, which a lot of people
good flexibility though
were impressed by. Yeah, exactly. I worked for the one time really that I've ever had a full-time media job was when I worked for the Young Turks. Or TYT for about a year and a half from 2017 to 2018. But other than that one stretch of time, I've really been basically self-sufficient, self-employed. In that I either write for different publications, and or I have people pay me in terms of crowdfunding or subscriptions and that kind of thing. So it's a pretty good mix. And theoretically, I'm supposed to be working on a book, and I am working on it, just in case anybody who's in charge of that process is listening. So I shouldn't be vague. So, but that's still a bit in the future.
He has typed in, the title at least, and the
yeah. My name.
So my name's Dylan Burns. If you're not too familiar with me, I'll give you a basic rundown.
I know your Twitter handle. I know I've seen your handle, but I can't really give you much beyond that.
Sure, I'll just give you a basic background. So yeah. I've done some work in Maryland politics, like managing some local mayoral campaigns, being on the boards of some orgs. I've done like campaigns. Which towns in
Maryland?
College Park, the town that actually hosts the University of Maryland. I ran the mayor's election campaign.
Okay, yeah, I'm aware. I'm familiar with College Park. I've been there.
I love College Park. It's
I'm assuming that probably would have been a Democratic campaign, right?
Well, it's nonpartisan, but he is a Democrat.
Right.
Yeah. So
not many Republicans getting elected in College Park.
I've advised Michaela Wilkes and Jill Carter, State Senator Jill Carter, when they both ran for Congress.
That rings a bell.
Some people remember some of my time on the Gravel campaign when I was 18. I was one of the original Gravel teens.
Oh, were you?
Yes, I was. Have
I spoken to you before in that context? Because I talked to the Gravel teens.
Nope, I was the state director in Maryland, so I had a very unimportant general role in the whole scheme of things.
Okay. I attended a Democratic primary debate in 2019 in Miami with the Gravel teens. Like, we sat together.
Oh yeah, I was not with
the OG Gravel teens. Like, I think it was the two main guys who sort of founded it. I forget their names now.
Got you. I did that. Then I started a Twitch channel. I've been mostly known because I host a lot of debates, where I did host a lot of debates on this thing called the Hippy Dippy Roundtable with Vosh, Destiny, all these like internet personalities. They would clash. Alex Stein was also a guest we would have on. But now I'm most recently known because I went to Ukraine, I filmed there, and I'm planning to go back to Ukraine.
When did you go exactly?
I went over to Poland in April, and then I crossed the border in May. I was there for the majority of the war.
And when did you? How long were you physically in Ukraine? How long did you stay? When did you return?
Like 4 or 5 months, I would say I was there for. I returned about a month ago, and now I'm preparing to head back. I think I was in basically every oblast outside of Odessa that is in Ukrainian control. Obviously, I can't go to like Crimea or something like that. But I went to basically every oblast.
Why not Odessa? Just by happenstance, or was there some reason why you wouldn't have gone?
There was just nothing for me to film there. There wasn't much to report on. I thought about doing a story on the Moskva, but it would just be so I have an excuse to film on location. It's very beautiful beaches, but if I did want to do something there, I'd probably want to cover the Odessan Mafia if I ever did do a story on Odessa. I don't think there's much more for me to cover at the current time. But I don't think many people are interested in the Odessan Mafia right now, so I'd probably do it after the war.
You were there in like a journalistic capacity of some sort, right? I mean, you weren't...
Yeah, I had a press pass.
You weren't in combat or anything, right? Or were you? I don't know.
Technically, yes.
Were.
Yeah, I've been. Well, it depends on what you mean by combat. Like, I wasn't in hand-to-hand fighting, right? But I was shelled by the Russian army on a few occasions. The closest I ever was to the Russian front line was about a mile. I was about a mile from them, where I could see the tree line, they could see me. That was on the Zaporozhye front. I've been to the Donbass, which... Did
you engage in combat operations yourself?
No, I'm not a soldier. I filmed like some shelling that happened. I filmed like SPG-9 anti-armored training, but I'm not a soldier.
When you say you were shelled,
yeah,
what does that mean? Like you were in proximity to where a shell landed, or when were you injured or affected by it?
A shell fell about 150 feet away from me while I was in Mykolaiv. I was in Mykolaiv on August 29th, which was the day that the Kherson counteroffensive was launched. We were down there to deliver aid to a local dog shelter, and I wanted to film near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, like across the river, talk to locals about like the fear of another Chernobyl, because that's in the news a lot recently. And while we were down there, unbeknownst to us, the Kherson counteroffensive was launched, and we found out about it while we were sitting in a restaurant in Mykolaiv, and we were like, oh, this is crazy, like how is this going to affect our aid deliveries, because there's probably going to be an uptick in like shelling and stuff like that. What are we going to do? And then as we were leaving the restaurant, because I wanted a steak and milkshake, and God, that was a good steak and milkshake. If they would have got me there, I would have said I would have died with a full stomach, and I would have had a fantastic milkshake. But then the shelling started like falling like about 150 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet away from me. I released some of the footage of it actually on my channel if you wanted to go check it out. But now they were peppering the city center that day. They were being really aggressive.
Was it on August 29th that the Kherson counteroffensive was launched, or wasn't there like a sort of a head fake where they actually ultimately launched the counteroffensive in earnest in the north around Kharkiv? I mean, was there actual activity in Kherson on the 29th, or was it just kind of announced that there was?
So when I was in the restaurant, the first thing I got was texts from like contacts who were like, Dylan, you're in Mykolaiv, be careful, the Kherson counteroffensive was launched. And my initial reaction was, fuck off. Like, because we had heard so much. It had
been rumored for a long time.
Yeah, it had been rumored for a long time. A lot of people talked about it. A lot of people are saying, is this even like a real thing? But that night, I heard the most shelling that I had been for the whole war. And I had been to Kramatorsk, like I had been to the Donbass. And I mean, I think the most shelling I heard was like 50 explosions and a 30.
It was Russian shelling or Ukrainian shelling or both?
Both.
Okay,
the Ukrainians were hammering Russian positions, and it was really effective. They took some forward operating positions. Like, it was a very slow process. I would compare it more to Russian fighting in the Donbass and the Russian offensive to the Donbass than I would to say the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv and Kupiansk, which was very fast, very effective. I interviewed some soldiers who did participate in that. Very interesting interviews. I haven't released any of that, but I think they started that offensive in earnest, but I do think it also acted as a distraction for the Russians as well, because when I was there, like they were aggressively fighting. Like the Russians were just shelling the city center. Almost, it felt like in a panic. So I do think it was an earnestly launched offensive. It just took a lot more time than the Kharkiv counteroffensive, because the Russians had prepared it and packed it with more men than they had done around Kupiansk. Kupiansk had a very thin front line, and I think that's where they failed. It's because that's why mobilization happened after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, because the Russians realized that they can't even hold the front line with the manpower issues they were having at the time.
Right. Well, if nothing else, I have to commend you for your gumption in undertaking this journey or adventure or whatever. So because it definitely sounds like it was at least pretty edifying experience.
It's not that hard to get shot at, really. Like, you just kind of stand there and, like, then something happens. Either you live or you die. You try to, like, do things to keep you safe, but, like, yeah, it was gumption, but, like, I don't know. I can't take compliments well. I appreciate it, though. Thank you. Thank you. So I wanted to talk to you about a few things today. Obviously we're going to talk about Ukraine, but I don't.
And this isn't a trolling ambush, right? I'm not accusing you of anything.
Yeah, this is a fella operation.
I get the sense that we have enough of a rapport at this point that I don't really have to worry about a trolling ambush, and I wouldn't have even worried about it anyway, because maybe it would have been funny.
No, the fella operatives have yet to. The Azov people are headed to your home right now. They're gonna kick in the door. They're gonna take you off. We're gonna put you in an Azov penile battalion. But no, it's not a trolling operation. I do represent the fellas. I throw up fella gang signs, so I understand the inclination.
Because you might be aware that there are people affiliated with that online grouping who are pretty adamant in their trolling behavior toward me.
Oh yeah. I looked at your replies just to this convo, and it was just like just all across the board insults. I'm familiar. The internet is an aggressive place. We're like we're Ukraine Qaeda over here. I understand.
Yeah, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Unless they're really mean, then they do hurt. If they're
unless they're super mean,
unless they're super mean. I wanted to talk to you first about the midterms, because I'm very interested in your perspective, because I think we come from like probably like different ideological foundations here.
What would you say your ideological foundation is?
I would say I'm generally would be considered a libtard. Some people call me the shill of Kiev. But I'm like very, very like pro-democracy.
I don't think I've ever met a self-identified libtard before. So that's
my pronouns are lib and tard. Yes.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you, because I think we both have different critiques of Democrats and different critiques of Republicans. And so I wanted to ask you, what were you expecting heading into this midterm, and how was it different from what you received, like what we actually got?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am generally inclined to not spout off hard and fast predictions about political events or election outcomes, because much of the time that backfires and everybody gets egg on their face. And that was especially true for this particular midterm cycle, because I was having a conversation with somebody literally on the day of the midterm. So as voting was underway that afternoon, and I said to them, I genuinely wouldn't have enough confidence one way or another to even make a kind of passing prediction to you privately as to what I think the outcome would be, because there are truly enough plausible scenarios in like just kind of the spectrum of potential outcomes that I have kind of inchoately in my head that I wouldn't be surprised if there was a huge Republican sweep, if even maybe Democrats gain seats, and a variety of different outcomes in between, or a mix. There seemed to be more than typical uncertainty associated with this particular election. So in terms of what I was expecting, I didn't really have a whole lot of firm expectations. I was just kind of content to admit uncertainty and see how things shook out. Now, I do have to say that because I spent maybe the final 2 weeks before the election going to different congressional districts, mostly in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and just trying to cover some events and talk to candidates and so forth. If you had put a gun to my head on the day of the election, I would have thought that, for example, Republicans were likely to at least win a couple contested races in Pennsylvania, especially the House seats that were very closely fought. Because I went to a couple I interviewed a couple Republican congressional candidates, both of whom ended up losing in Pennsylvania, one in Western Pennsylvania, one in the Northeast. And part of the reason why I sought them out was because it seemed reasonably likely that they would win and they would be entering Congress, right? And so, yeah, I was mildly surprised, I would say.
Did either of them win?
No, they both lost. One of them was a guy who, a Republican who's so generic that it's even hard to remember his name. It was Josh Schaefer, and he lost to a Democrat, Chris DeLuzio, and they were running in an open seat that had been previously occupied by Connor Lamb, who then tried to run the Democratic primary for Senate against Fetterman and lost. So that seat was open. Seemed like a very ripe pickup opportunity for Republicans. It was sort of like on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, but in a Republican-leaning district. Or so it seemed, at least in terms of this climate. And then in the northeast of Pennsylvania, around Luzerne County and Pike County, and parts of places on the border with New Jersey in the northeast, Matt Cartwright, the incumbent Democratic senator, was one of the very few members of Congress very few Democrats who won in 2020 in a district that Trump also won. So that used to be pretty common in American history with, ticket splitting and stuff, but with partisan polarization has become less and less common, or so it seems anyway. And so this was one of the premier opportunities, it appeared, for a Republican to oust a Democratic incumbent. But that candidate, Jim Bognett, also appears to have lost. And I say appears to have lost because there's some stupendous problems with the voting administration in Luzerne County, where on election day, literally, there was a mass shortage of paper. And they have a system in Luzerne County where literal pieces of paper have to be fed into the voting machine in order for a vote to be cast. And so I actually ended up spending another couple days there after the election because there was a total shambles with nobody knowing who's exactly responsible for what in terms of election administration. There's like turf battles between the election board, the election bureau, the county manager. I mean, it's a whole mess. So I was covering some of that, working on a piece that's going to hopefully come out this week. I wanted to get it out last week, but I ended up having to do other stuff. So, but it's pretty crazy as to the level of just sheer. I mean, to even call it incompetence does not capture the enormity of how ridiculous it was that basically there was just a total election failure in Luzerne County for the midterms this year. Now, I mean, they'll probably certify the election anyway, but as far as I know, I haven't checked. I forgot to check today actually, but last I checked, the Republican candidate hadn't actually conceded yet, and frankly, for good reason, not for one of these crazed conspiratorial reasons about. I don't know, the Italian intelligence service is hacking voting machines, but because literally both parties agree, everyone agrees 100% confirmed and demonstrably, verified by everybody that there was just this absolutely incredible failure in just the basic mechanics of the voting system there. So anyway, to address your question, I would have thought that the Republican candidate in that district was likelier than not to have to win. But again, I would just kind of want to reserve judgment, not really do a whole kind of not indulge in too much pontificating about future events, because that tends to be a dicey proposition.
So I think like going into this midterm, I was actually at Wes Moore's election night party. He was the Democratic candidate.
Whose party? Oh, the governor candidate.
Yeah, the governor. Yeah. Sorry, I said mayoral. Wes Moore. I was at his election night party when all the news was coming in. And when the results started to come in, I got more and more hopeful as the night went on because I wanted the Democrats largely to hold. And what we ended up getting was vastly different than what I thought, what the pollsters thought, and I think most mainstream media thought, which is that the Democrats largely avoided a red wave situation. Not only did they largely avoid a red wave, in some areas, I would even say a small blue wave occurred, definitely on the state level. Like when you're talking about Michigan. In Michigan, it was supposed to be like a close race between Gretchen Whitmer and her opponent. And it was it was double-digit curb stomping. when we talk about like the Michigan House being like the Democrats picking up a trifecta, this is actually
first time in 40 years.
First time in 40 years. Did you know this is the first time since 1934 that during a president's first midterm they actually net picked up governorship? They didn't lose governorships. This is the first time since FDR during the president's first midterm, because the president's first midterm is supposed to be a disaster. It was for Bill Clinton, it was for Obama, it was for Trump. That's just the tradition. So for me, it's kind of weird watching this happen, because it wasn't just like Republicans.
It was for Reagan too. I mean, people forget 1982 was basically a wave year for Democrats, even though, you know, Reagan was seen as like unimpeachably popular because he won in a landslide in his reelection race in '84 against Mondale. But, you know, Democrats, they swamped the Republicans in '82. Yeah,
we picked up seats. And so to see this happen, it leads me to like think like, why exactly did the Republicans, I mean, largely fail to produce a red wave to the point where Democrats are not only holding a blue wall, but they might pick up a seat in the Senate. They picked up governorships. They overturned multiple state legislators to trifectas, and they defended the state legislatures they had. I mean, why do you think this is? I have some ideas, but I would want to know what
you were expecting. Your expectation was that there would be a red wave or a red tsunami.
I didn't think there was going to be a red tsunami, but I thought there would at least be like the wave would at least reach my shoulders, but it didn't even like touch my toes.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think like these pundit conceits, and I'm not accusing you of having this conceit, but there does seem it's pretty much ingrained into the pundit psyche that there have to be these conceits about how future events are going to unfold, and it always ends up blowing up in their faces. So I don't know why they don't just get out of the business of these prognostication rituals. I mean, they're not even informative in the first place. They're like parlor games. I mean, you're better off betting on sports, because, you know, although you say it's generally the case that the party out of power in the president's first midterm is going to do well. Yeah, in recent history, that has tended to be the case, but we do actually have a pretty significant example in recent years of when that was not the case. 2002. I mean, of course, there was extenuating circumstances, right? Because George W. Bush had sky-high approval ratings post 9/11. That tapered off as 2002 approached, but still, he was kind of buoyed by the post 9/11 war fervor atmosphere, and Republicans actually defied those traditional expectations and gained seats in 2002. So it's not like totally unthinkable that something like this could happen, and there probably has to be certain extenuating circumstances, and it's worth definitely to try to sift through what those extenuating circumstances could have been here. I also think that, you know, the picture is a lot more mixed maybe than people appreciate, because I mean, in Michigan, definitely Pennsylvania, you know, a handful of other states, Democrats did drastically overperform based on what you might have anticipated if you were just going off the pundit consensus. But then you also have, you know, some countervailing examples that kind of go against that trend. New York being a big one. Republicans won 7 of 8 contested House seats in New York.
They netted 4. Democratic failure. It was really bad.
Yeah, even North Carolina got much less attention, but Republicans consolidated their gains basically on the state and federal level. Even California, which, you know, people wouldn't think was even in the realm of possibility for Republican gains, maybe if they're sort of ill-informed. But Republicans actually looked like they probably overperformed relative to 2020 in key districts by an average of around 10 points. Now, that's just a rough approximation based on my sort of preliminary scan of some of the data. But, you know, there's a race in the LA area that the incumbent Republican Mike Garcia won, that voted for Biden in 2020, you know, post redistricting. So if you kind of just transplant the current district to 2020, that district voted for Biden by, I think, was it 11 points? And then Garcia won by 3 or 4. So, you know, obviously there's always going to be localized factors in every race, whether it's incumbency, whether
Florida's the most obvious example of
I mean, of course, Florida. I mean, and so if there's a red wave of sorts in Florida, New York, California, I mean, Republicans even netted a seat in Oregon, right? So it's just a mixed bag. And actually, the one incumbent governor who did lose was the Democratic governor, Steve Sisolak in Nevada, who was defeated by his Republican challenger, Lombardo. So yeah, I mean, it's clearly a mixed bag. I think, the fact that Pennsylvania failed so spectacularly for Republicans, and it was called relatively early on election night, kind of colored the perceptions of how the entire race was how the entire election was shaking out nationally, and rightly so, because I mean that was an enormous failure and a humiliating self dealt blow by Republicans in Pennsylvania. But you also, again, there's a lot of regional, I guess, variegation to this particular election that doesn't lend itself to one sweeping, unified narrative, which is not very satisfying for people who are in like the punditry sphere, because you want to have just sort of an easy, sort of all encompassing explanation for political events. But sometimes, that's just not how things work. And so I
tend to agree. There is a mixed bag here, but I think the event is tinted blue, and I think it's correctly tinted blue. Republicans were able to make one major gain, I think, in this election, and that was they got the House, which means they're going to be able to.
Which is significant.
It's significant. It means they can launch investigations, they can compel testimony, and they can also, try to slow down Biden's legislative agenda by, not voting for.
Well, and they control all the committee chairs, which is like what every congressman dreams of when they're in the minority.
Yeah, and so that's like the biggest win for them, but that win's also limited because their majority is going to be like 3-4 votes, and so it's also a very slight majority that is going to be difficult for Kevin McCarthy.
Sure, I mean, remember, Democrats. I tend to interrupt. I try to restrain myself, but I apologize.
Okay, no worries. I'll start to interrupt later. I think like this is going to be difficult for like a Kevin McCarthy majority to hold together, definitely when they're in the midst of what seems like a lot of infighting within the Republican Party between the Trump faction and the Ron DeSantis, more seen as the establishment faction. It's like, okay, this election was bad news for Trump, maybe we should move on. And this is also in the same framing where Republicans largely lost on the state level and Republicans lost on the Senate. Not only did they not take the Senate, but there might be an expansion of the Democratic Senate majority that's going to make it a lot easier for them to do court appointments. And so like the most fair you could be for Republicans in this election, I would say, is calling it generally a wash. I think would be like the most fair you could be.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think when it comes to the causes of this, and I would like to discuss this with you. I actually have a list of 5 things. I worked on a video and I researched, so I want to discuss this premise with you. Okay. I wanted to go through these. The first reason I would say is abortion was a much bigger contributor to their loss than they could have anticipated. I think that there was some early warning signs from certain Republican establishment leaders before, when Roe versus Wade was overturned. But I think as inflation dominated the headlines more, that people got a little comfortable. They kind of forgot. But when you're talking about Michigan, 45% of voters at the poll in Michigan said that abortion was their #1 issue. And that directly translated not only to them enshrining abortion.
That's an exit poll?
Yeah, that was an exit poll. They not only did they enshrine it in the state constitution and
you know what agency did that exit poll by any chance?
I don't remember exactly. I can send you.
I'm not doubting you. I just want to look it up myself if I can.
I got it listed on the document here. I can send it to you after. But they not only voted to enshrine abortion in the state's constitution, which I think is what motivated a lot of people to come out, but Gretchen Whitmer, in what was supposed to be a close race, curb stomped her opponent with it was double digits. Yeah. And she's seen as a very pro-choice candidate, and I think that's part of the reason why. And in Pennsylvania, like abortion, and a lot of these swing states where Republicans failed, abortion was like a top level issue. If you poll voters across the board, abortion, it was inflation at 31, abortion at 27. It's like right behind inflation. And so I think Republicans didn't fully realize how much this was going to have an impact and the deflation effect on their supposed red wave. Would you agree with that?
Well, just very quickly, when I interrupted you before, I just wanted to make a very quick point about just like the nature of the incoming Republican majority compared to the outgoing Democratic majority. Remember, Pelosi, at post 2020, only had a Democratic majority in the House of, I think, 6 or 7 seats, if I'm not mistaken. So really not that different at all from the margin that McCarthy seemingly is going to have starting in January, which is why I tend to generally agree with you that the most generous characterization to Republicans that you can make of this election, broadly speaking, is that it's kind of just a perpetuation of the status quo, right? With a marginal shift, very narrowly. And so I think that's probably how I would put it, not because I want to be particularly generous to Republicans, but, it is true that Republicans are actually ahead pretty substantially in the national popular vote when it comes to the House of Representatives. Not that that means anything or it's binding on anything, but it's one sort of metric to sort of use to just gauge the overall outcome. And if Republicans were like losing every contested seat everywhere, particularly in the House, then I would agree that it's a total bust for Republicans. But if they're winning, the 4 seats in New York, in Oregon, they won a very closely contested seat in Arizona for the House, even though they screwed up royally on the gubernatorial and senatorial levels. Again, there are even a couple seats in California that trended Republican pretty markedly. And also Iowa. I mean, Iowa now has not a single Democratic federal representative. So that was another, gain. And, Republicans, they won a seat in New Jersey, actually. Tom Malinowski lost, the incumbent Democrat who I interviewed and didn't have the most pleasant exchange with, but he's out. So yeah, if like every potentially competitive race was just totally bungled by Republicans across the board, then I would be withholding any chance of offering that more generous explanation. But given that you can point to some of these more countervailing examples, and again, these are not that you can point to them in New York and Florida in particular. And that's significant. I mean, those are 2 of the 5 biggest states in the country. So, yeah, I would say kind of I would view it generally in terms of a basic ratification of the status quo. That's not the sexiest takeaway, but as banal as it might seem to put it that way, that seems to be roughly the most accurate. Top line surmise. Yeah.
I think you could say, though, that Democrats largely got out of, if you were to analyze the best case scenario for both parties going into this, Democrats largely got most of what they wanted, and Republicans got a very, I think, small percentage of what they wanted. Like going into this election.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that's Democrats fair. There's a reason why Joe Biden, if you poll people, there's a reason why people are like, who's the biggest winner out of this election? It's the Democrats and Ron DeSantis.
That's fair. I guess. If you just, this is impossible to do, but like imagine you could, in theory, you could totally divorce your analysis of these election outcomes from expectations or pundit kind of prognostications about what was going to happen, or like what the expectations, quote unquote, were. Like, right, if you could just do away with all these meta discursive sort of considerations around what people thought was going to happen, and just strictly looked at what the results are, right? Okay, you have a probably a +1 for the Democrats in the Senate. You have a plus like 7-8 for Republicans in the House. You have on a gubernatorial level, I mean, it's sort of weird to group them together because you have a Republican governor of Vermont who was reelected, but most national Republicans would even accept that he is a Republican. But the one incumbent governor who did lose was a Democrat, like I said, in Nevada. Incumbents across the board just overperformed in an almost absurdist fashion, like in Wisconsin, right? Ron Johnson narrowly wins re-election as the incumbent Republican senator, but then the incumbent Democratic governor Evers, he wins as well, and it's kind of like almost by the same margin. So it's almost like people are just mindlessly pressing the button on the voting machine for the incumbent, regardless of what party they are or what they've even done in office. I mean, that's probably not literally true, but yeah, but the power of incumbency was affirmed.
A lot of Republican failures in this election, especially when you talk about Maryland and my state. We had Larry Hogan for the last 2 sessions, and he was his candidate to replace him was Dan Cox. This is a guy who was never going to win in Maryland, and so
who Hogan opposed.
Hogan wouldn't even endorse him. He wouldn't even endorse the guy because he was so, like, I kind of want to call him a cockadoo. And so he ended up getting curb stomped. He didn't do very well. And there's a lot of governorships like that where Democrats flipped it because the option, the Republican option, was just too radical for these states that they were running in. There's no way you're going to get an election denier to win an election in Maryland for governor. That was just not an option. And I feel like a lot of this, that a lot of people are taking away from this, that Donald Trump doesn't have amazing political instincts when it comes to choosing candidates. When he chose to endorse Dr. Oz a month before the primary, and Dr. Oz won by 1,000 votes. So you can't argue that Donald Trump didn't basically choose who was the primary candidate. He did. Same with JD Vance. JD Vance performed well against Tim Ryan. I was upset. And
also Blake Masters. You know, there was not a given that Blake Masters was going to win the primary.
It wasn't. I mean, Blake Masters was. But the thing is, you can see these Republican candidates getting more and more extreme in the primary, saying things like Blake Masters compared abortion to genocide during the Republican primary. And then when he went to the general, he's like, what do you mean? I don't want to ban all abortion. How do you call something
Didn't he
genocide?
take it off his website or something?
Yeah, he took it off of his website. And then when you go to Dr. Oz and a lot of these candidates who then they went crazy in the primary and then they tried to make everybody forget about it in the general. But leaving the Pennsylvania election, this was the statistic that really blew me away. More people viewed Dr. Oz as the radical candidate than John Fetterman, even though Dr. Oz ran largely on this idea that John Fetterman is this radical socialist Bernie Sanders type who's going to bring weed and criminal lawlessness to Pennsylvania and destroy America. And that message just didn't reach them because people saw his attachment to Donald Trump and people saw some of the things he said during the primary and they remembered it and they walked away from it saying that he was the radical. And also the carpetbagger thing was super effective. 54% of people who left, who voted on election day said that Dr. Oz wasn't Pennsylvanian enough to be a senator from Pennsylvania. What a terrible thing to say about somebody once they're. I mean, it's an accurate.
He literally
thing.
registered to vote in his in-laws' house in Montgomery County in 2020. Was it, or even 2021? I mean, it was like for a very short period of time ago. I mean, the guy's from New Jersey. My thought in terms of Oz, and I actually went to an Oz event in outside Pittsburgh the week before the election. It was bizarre. I mean, I know the idiocracy trope is sort of overdone, but I couldn't help but to have that sort of flash in my head as I was observing.
So,
but yeah, my thing was that Oz should just run in New Jersey. He should run in his true home state. I mean, probably has just as much chances in Pennsylvania. So the whole carpetbagging thing was like a self-inflicted wound if he actually does want to gain elected office at some point.
I think that's a basic bipartisan belief that you should live in the district that you represent, like
the state. I mean, district is a little bit more complicated because oftentimes members of Congress don't actually live in their specifically delineated district. Yeah, but usually there's not a question in terms of whether you live in a state. Yeah.
So I'm like I guess I'm a radical. I believe if you should live in the district that you represent, and you should live there.
I tend to agree.
Of time, but he wasn't even like in the state. Like he was. It was like blatant what he was doing. And he ran.
He didn't even live like. Yeah, he didn't even live in the parts of New Jersey that are kind of like culturally intertwined with Pennsylvania. So like the Philly suburbs or something in Burlington County. The guy literally lives right across the Hudson River in Bergen County because it's right near where the TV studios are for his syndicated, dopey show.
I wanted to bring it back to the question, and then I wanted to ask you about Herschel Walker because the main request I've gotten from people is to ask you about one tweet. So I do need to ask you about it. But I wanted to get back to the question I asked you earlier.
That's the main request? That's surprising. Yeah, okay.
That was the main request. Do you think abortion was a major contributor to the Republicans' loss? Because I think it was a major contributor.
I definitely. It seems very plausible to me that it was a contributing factor. How much to quantify it, whether to say it was the decisive factor, state, I'm not sure. Right? Yeah, it depends on the state. That's like much else with this election, which is kind of why it's difficult to assign like a grand narrative. Right?
But if you look at every single referendum on abortion,
you're right. Yeah, even Kentucky,
it is overwhelmingly, and like some of these like positions are not.
Was it Kentucky or Tennessee that had the referendum?
I forget. Multiple. Michigan. It was a lot of states.
I know there was one in Kentucky which you wouldn't have expected would have been. Yeah, would have passed.
It seems that every single time there's a referendum to restrict a woman's right to choose in any way, it loses, and it motivates Democrats to come out. To me, like if you look at that even in Kentucky, the Republicans are losing on abortion. Then when you think of states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, there's no way they can win on that issue. The Republican Party has taken a radical position on abortion. They finally got the thing they wanted, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And now to bring it back to the state level, and now they've turned to the state level saying it's your time to shine. And every single time you get to ask the people who live in the United States, they say, no, we don't want to ban abortion. What are you talking about? Of course we don't.
Yeah,
And
I think abortion was pretty clearly a factor, but I guess a reason why I'm a bit hesitant to
I would say it was a major factor.
ascribe it with all encompassing like dispositive explanatory value is because why would abortion have been hyper salient in Pennsylvania but not New York, right? And because the trend lines were very different in New York compared to Pennsylvania, including even in some of these counties in like western or central New York that are literally adjacent to Pennsylvania. You saw the trend lines very favor Republicans in New York, disfavor Republicans in Pennsylvania, and so it would be strange if abortion really were this all-encompassing explanatory dispositive factor that you would have seen such divergent outcomes in New York and Pennsylvania. Now, what do I think was the divergent variable in New York or Pennsylvania?
I think I have an explanation.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Oh, so let me just finish the thought. In New York, you had a competitive gubernatorial race for the first time in quite a while, where the Republican gained a lot of momentum. Lee Zeldin, as the race sort of reached its climax, and a lot of resources poured in from National Republican Party organizations to help Zeldin. DeSantis went to New York. Glenn Youngkin went to campaign in New York as well. So there was a momentum around Zeldin, right? Whereas in Pennsylvania, Mastriano was basically abandoned by the party apparatus with weeks or even months still to go, right? It wasn't seen as competitive at all, really, in the gubernatorial race.
But there was no.
So I do think that given that's the top of the ticket, right? There is sort of a cross office galvanizing impact that a really competitive gubernatorial race can have, which is why you saw down ballot Republicans probably overperformed in New York, whereas they underperformed in Pennsylvania. So to me, the most clear-cut explanatory variable that explains the discrepancy between New York and Pennsylvania is not that there's like some radical difference in attitudes toward abortion among like comparable demographics in New York and Pennsylvania, but because you had these wildly divergent outcomes in terms of how the gubernatorial races unfolded. So that seems more plausible to me than abortion, although I'm not denying at all. I think you're right that in general, abortion probably was a motivating factor for Democrats just in general, and in certain jurisdictions maybe could well have had a decisive role.
I think I somewhat disagree with you on this. So if you look at like what the Republicans were running on in New York, the ones that won in these districts that were competitive, they weren't running on an abortion ban. They weren't running off of, hey, we're going to stop these baby murderers, because that wouldn't have won in New York. Because the reason New York people in New York turned
either were Oz or Mastriano.
Mastriano was kind of running on abortion restrictions, but
in the primaries, he did the same thing as other Republicans. In the primaries, he had more radical statements, and the general election, he kind of just ignored it.
But that wasn't across the board for the Republicans that were running in New York. They weren't like, I don't think they were stamping on that as much as Doug Mastriano or Dr. Oz or a lot of these Republican candidates in other states were. Also, in Pennsylvania,
my impression was that at least in the House candidates in New York and Pennsylvania, basically more or less had the same attitude on abortion because they got talking points from the national party committees, like the National Republican Congressional Committee, just like the DCCC, the NRCC, basically sends out these nationally sanctified talking points on critical issues. They did it on Ukraine, by the way, as well, by the way. But on abortion, it was basically leave it to the states. I might be personally pro-life, but I'm not going to meddle with existing law in my state if abortion is permitted. That was basically the posture of Republicans in most states, other than the heavily Republican-leading states like Oklahoma or something.
Okay, I would like to finish this thought though.
I'm sorry.
So when we're talking about New York, the political environment in New York and in Michigan are vastly different. Specifically, I think one of the main things I would point to is abortion was on the ballot in Michigan. And since it was a referendum on abortion, that's going to motivate people to come out and fight on abortion, because now it's a political issue that has to be debated. It's on the referendum. And so that's something that motivated Democrats to come out in Michigan. And that's part of the reason I think Gretchen Whitmer curb-stomped her political opponent, despite the fact that many people see her as a very divisive Democrat. And I think in New York specifically, if you look at the Republicans running on the ticket, they largely avoided the statements that Herschel Walker has made on abortion, Blake Masters have made on abortion, what Doug Mastriano said in the primary about abortion. They ran on the economy. because they wanted to run on the thing that they were strong on, not the thing that Republicans are generally weak on when it comes to winning over independents. And they had to win over independents to win in New York. So I would basically say is that the New York Republican Party ran a more aggressive campaign, not around abortion though. And I think they generally avoided that topic, whereas Herschel Walker, Dr. Oz, especially Blake Masters, and a lot of these other races where it was already on the ballot, that wasn't really a possibility.
I'm not sure about that. I think at least in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, and even in Florida. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I might have missed something, but I don't think like DeSantis really emphasized abortion all that much when he was running, or Rubio, or even congressional candidates in Florida really were abortion focused in the general election, right? So
exactly, and the states where Republicans perform really well are the states where they didn't run on abortion.
Well, no, but I'm saying I don't think that the general posture taken by Republicans in Florida and New York toward abortion differed materially all that much from the general posture taken by Republicans in like Pennsylvania or Michigan. But I do think you're right. I do think you're right.
Though, right?
The campaigns are well in Michigan. You're definitely correct to point out the salience of there actually being a ballot referendum up for a vote. I mean, I do think that almost certainly had a galvanizing impact that favored Democrats, because it's almost like the converse of why Karl Rove was so dead set on making sure that he could get as many anti-gay marriage ballot referendums up for a vote in 2004. And that probably sealed like Ohio in 2004 for Bush, right? Because you had simultaneously to the presidential election a referendum to ban gay marriage that passed and kind of galvanized maybe certain voters that might not be as motivated to vote specifically for Bush, but if they're there anyway to vote against gay marriage, they'll vote for Bush, right? So I think it's kind of a converse situation with some of these abortion referendums, especially in marginally more Democratic-leaning states like Michigan. So yeah, no, I agree with the issue salience of abortion in that respect. I just think I wouldn't overstate there being some radical or really even that substantial difference between how Republicans approach the issue in different states. Because remember, Republicans in general try to basically just nationalize and streamline their messaging on abortion, because anytime a Republican says something wacky anywhere in the country, that could be used against a Republican who's the most moderate guy in the world in like New York or New Jersey or wherever, right? Because they're made to account for, especially with Trump sort of looming in the background. Remember, Trump actually endorsed Lee Zeldin. Mm-hmm. Now, Lee Zeldin was seen as fairly successful of a candidate, right? But he wasn't seen as a quote Trump candidate in the same way. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because it's sort of like a narrative contingency or something. But I do think given the regional variation that you see evident pretty much everywhere across the country, I do think that the gubernatorial races in particular and how much momentum the Republican or Democratic nominee was able to seize in their particular state, those were the decisive factors, given that in general, it was kind of just more a status quo type election on national terms. So if you have like the added variable of an overperforming state campaign, particularly for governor, then that could tip certain candidates over the edge in different states. That to me is probably the best way to think about differences between states that otherwise are not like hugely distinct from one another in terms of cultural attitudes, like a New York versus a Pennsylvania.
I think I'm more trying to like point to the fact that this election, like abortion, was like a losing issue for Republicans, and
I think that's probably right.
And like that's why I think the Republicans who distance themselves from that topic the most when it comes to banning or stuff like that, and distance their rhetoric, even if they believe the same things, were the ones that were most successful, because it's not the type of thing you win over independents over by saying abortion's like a genocide and we need to ban abortion. Like Herschel, and like Masters have said.
And it makes intuitive sense that abortion would have been a losing issue for Republicans here, right? Because Republicans are the one who made won a historic victory on abortion, right, with the Supreme Court case in June. So it's not like Republicans needed to rush out to the polls to ensure that abortion was going to, it wasn't as though they were being beckoned to the polls to ensure that Roe versus Wade would be overturned or something, right? In other words, the galvanizing factor in terms of abortion for Republicans had already been achieved. So it kind of took the wind out of their sails in terms of being able to do these incendiary emotional appeals for why Republicans needed to continue to vote on the abortion issue. Had lost issue.
Lindsey Graham
had lost issue salience for Republicans, but gained issue salience for Democrats. That's the way I think about it, anyway.
Lindsey Graham really fucked him with that press conference, huh? Like, hey, you know, when it comes to these, like, even you can even see it when he proposed this abortion ban idea, which isn't exactly abortion ban, but restrictions on abortion on the federal level. You looked at Mitch McConnell when they asked him about it. He was like, "Oh, Lindsey did what now before the midterm? What did he say about abortion before the midterm?" I do want to move on because
I must have heard that Lindsey Graham bill referenced by Democrats, to attack their Republican opponent in about a dozen, House or Senate debates across the country.
That's the thing, is when you talk about leadership, like Lindsey Graham has been somebody who's an influential Republican leader. What he says about abortion, no matter if that specific Republican is in favor or against abortion or is okay with it or not, it's not going to really matter, because the argument could easily be made like they're going to whip this guy in line like they do with everyone, and he's going to vote with his party. And therefore, if you give the seat to a Republican, they're going to come after your abortion rights. And I don't think that had as massive an impact, because I think if they distance themselves, they can help protect themselves from that kind of an impact. But I certainly think it had an impact. I do want to move on because we've almost been talking for
one quick point before I forget, Daniel. I promise.
Okay, but it has to be quick.
Give me 2 sentences. Yeah. No, I think what you said there, it speaks to the general trend, which is that there's a lot more fluidity and intra-party disputation now among Democrats among Republicans than there is Democrats. Democrats are basically unified on on lots of stuff. Not a whole lot of discord that you could see, to use a pun, given that we're on Discord right now. Whereas for Republicans, there's kind of more ideological turmoil. There's more, even you might say, a more vibrant debate happening within the Republican Party than there is within the Democratic Party. And the abortion issue also kind of plays into that in the way that you articulated. But yeah, go on.
That was 6 sentences. But
sorry,
it's okay. The next big thing, and I just want to kind of
I use ellipses, so they all blend together.
Got you. Gen Z turnout. I think Gen Z turnout was higher than average. The Gen Z turnout this election, I do think really helped Democrats. I think Gen Z is kind of like Gen Z, a young voter turnout, is kind of like a sleeping political giant for Democrats. And the goal has never been like not necessarily even winning their support. They break pro-Democrat like 28 points. The task for people like Bernie Sanders, whose base is largely young people in large part, has always been just getting them to the polls. And in this election, I think they are more successful than they usually are. Usually they're at around 20% turnout for a midterm, because it's a midterm. A lot of people don't care about politics or a midterm. This election, they were 27%. That's down from the 31% of 2018, but means that Democrats were still able to retain a lot of the blue wave gains that they had in 2018. And so I think that if Democrats continue to invest in trying to get these young people to turn out, they can continue to have decent performances like they had on the midterms.
Yeah, I mean, when you say, I'm sort of leery of generalizing about midterms at all at this point, because when you say what, quote unquote, what usually happens in midterms, something I think may well be historically unprecedented has happened in the past couple midterm cycles, where you've had this radical sort of ricochet between wildly variant outcomes in midterms. So 2014, it was a huge low point for midterm turnout. I think it was the lowest turnout for any midterm election since 1940, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then in 2018, so the very next midterm cycle, it was the largest turnout for any midterm election since 1914. So you're kind of like, ping pong back and forth between these hugely discrepant outcomes in terms of overall voter engagement. So one of the titanic shifts of 2018 and of the Trump era generally was that it definitely radicalized, not radicalized, but it definitely
motivated young people.
It definitely even just kind of formed the initial political consciousness of lots of young people. So like Trump and the whole mayhem of that period is like the formative political experience that they'll have if they're of a certain age. Like if in the Trump
if you're my
period
age,
was when the first if you're around your age, right? And that's hugely significant basically for your entire life trajectory in terms of how you conceptualize politics. So even though the turnout rates for younger voters might have declined somewhat compared to 2018, you're still going to see the after effects of that Trump era mobilization, even if the margins, relatively speaking to other demographic groups, might erode somewhat. So in general, I agree with you.
Next one. I think election denial really, really hurt Republicans in a lot of these competitive races, especially with their Secretary of Race, Secretary of State elections, and in the races where I think they could have had the most influence going into 2024. I think election denial was a major contributor to some losses that they took, some L's they took, and motivated Democrats to turn out. It was a big thing I saw in Maryland when I was talking to people. This idea of the defense of democracy was something that was brought up constantly when I was at that Biden rally in Maryland. Do you agree with me that election denial was something that undermined them and made Republicans look kind of whiny and, excuse the term, but kind of a little bitchy?
Well, this is going to be a very hot take, so buckle your seatbelt. I actually don't even accept the premise of the term election denier being a valid sort of discursive point that we can both use for our own purposes. Maybe that was a bad way of putting it. I reject the term election denier. I think it's a propaganda term. I think it was basically whipped up by partisan Democratic interests and then amplified by Democratic Party adjacent media organs as a specifically pejorative term to wield against Republicans. Now, of course, it is true that many Republicans did contest the validity of the 2020 election, some more extreme than others, somewhat further than others, right? So I'm not denying that phenomenon existed. I just think this catch-all term election denier and the utility that it was seized for by Democrats in this particular election cycle is pure partisan propaganda. And I'm not even saying propaganda as like a denunciation, right? I mean, both parties use propaganda to serve their own interests. Republicans use plenty of it in this cycle as well. But it's a propaganda term, but then because Democrats have more of a cultural and political kind of synchronicity with the media, there's a permeable border between the propaganda terms that they invent, I mean, the Democrats, and then the terms that get just adopted into the popular parlance by the media. So why do I reject the validity of that term? Well, because its definition is so purposefully fluid and inconsistent and never impartially applied, right? So post the election, the last weekend or the weekend before this past one, if you watch the Sunday shows, which I sometimes subject myself to, or often I do anyway, I don't know why, I guess I'm a sadist. Here's the CBS, so on Face the Nation, the flagship morning talk show, they define the term election denier as merely raising doubts about the veracity of the 2020 election. So not that you stormed the Capitol or even that you voted against certifying Arizona and Georgia or whatever, merely raising doubts about certain aspects of election administration procedure. That was enough to get you officially labeled by CBS as an election denier because they did a whole comprehensive tally of Republicans in Congress and who is an election denier and who isn't. Right. So that was their criteria for who's an election denier. Now, I'm older than you, by no fault of your own and no fault of mine.
Very sorry.
But one of the first election that I really ever followed as a reasonably sentient being was 2004. I wasn't of voting age in 2004, but I was, interested in politics enough that I followed it pretty closely. Right. And there was a huge amount of consternation post 2004 election about the veracity of the election result in Ohio. Now, I'm not saying that anybody stormed any capitals in 2004. Didn't happen, right? But there was a robust discourse among Democrats, and largely among progressive Democrats, relatively speaking, as opposed to the blue dogs or whatever, around how basically Republicans in one form or another rigged the election in Ohio because there was a Republican Secretary of State. His name was Ken Blackwell. He was a Bush ally, et cetera. There's a whole school of thought around how Ohio was unfairly tilted against Democrats in 2004, hence why Bush won, right? So those were, huge percentage of the Congressional Black Caucus, Progressive Caucus, et cetera, 2004, they objected to the results in Ohio, some formally, some informally, on the ground that election procedure had been wrongfully skewed by Republicans who were in charge of election administration in Ohio. So if the criteria we're going with in terms of who's an election denier is simply raising doubts about the veracity of election outcomes, then I'm sorry, in pretty much every election cycle since I've been alive, definitely starting with 2000, election deniers have been more concentrated among Democrats. Now, I don't deny for a second that Republicans and Trump took things to a different level and did unique things post 2020, and it's not even unwarranted to assign the things they did certain unique labels. But I'm saying, given the amorphousness of this label, where any Republican who says even something like, oh, geez, maybe we should change chain of custody law around mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, or maybe they're too lax at this point. If even that guy is an election denier, then the term really has no meaning other than as a partisan cudgel. And yeah, it probably the mass adoption of the term may well have been effective as a partisan cudgel in certain contexts. But I in a way actually think that the substantive point is more important, because if it was a propaganda, if it worked, it was a propaganda triumph on the part of Democrats and their Democratic aligned sort of actors within the media, the activist world. But I do think that there are some really glaring substantive flaws in how that term ended up being so widely used that kind of get elided if I just accept your premise and go along with the term election denier.
Okay, so personally, I don't believe anybody who raises a concern about regulations around voting or how to conduct voting or problems that occurred in Maricopa County, I don't think every single one of those people is an election denier.
What if they cast doubt on the outcome?
What if they cast doubt on the outcome?
Yeah.
I would say
when the veracity of the outcome.
On 2020, when you say veracity of the outcome, do you mean like that it was the correct outcome, that this is the will of the people? Like,
no, they still, stuff like you say the election was stolen, the winner won illegitimately.
Yeah, I think that type of dialogue could legitimately get you labeled an election denier.
Okay, then in that case, I'm sorry to do the what about Hillary thing.
Yeah, but
Hillary Clinton did that.
You're kind of going on a ramble a little bit.
Sorry,
I'd like to respond.
I apologize.
So I would say, like, we could talk about Hillary Clinton, who ended up like conceding the election the next day, which is, I don't think, really comparable to Donald Trump. Stacey Abrams is somebody that I criticized when she, when she did her whole spiel about the results of her election. She could say, oh, there were this problem or that problem, but we lost at the end of the day because these are the rules we ran under. And I was really concerned going into this election. Thankfully, she immediately conceded after the results of this election. But when we're talking about election denial here, we're talking about Blake Masters on the campaign trail saying, I believe Donald Trump won the 2020 election. He's the rightful president of the United States. I believe Carrie Lake saying those types of things is different than what we see being talked about mainstream Democrats when we talk about running for these same positions. And it's also different considering that Donald Trump wrote up executive orders about seizing voting machines when everything was going down. He didn't end up going through with it. He didn't sign it, thank God. And he also directly called Brian Kemp and just asked him. Thankfully, Brian Kemp held the line here, and he just basically told him, like, hey, Brian, I need you to find the exact number of votes necessary for me to win. That he gave them the exact number.
Raffensperger, I think.
It was Raffensperger? I thought it was Brian Kemp. It was Raffensperger. He called him and said, you need to get me the exact amount of votes necessary for me to win, which I think is pretty obvious what his intentions were there. He even told him that, hey, now, if you don't do this, you're not following the law, and there will be consequences for this. He was even telling him, like, he was trying to intimidate him into finding the votes for him to win. And so I do think that if you aligned yourself with these positions, that scares a lot of the middle of the road independent types, and it definitely motivates Democrats to come out. You could even see in a lot of these races where some of the ballots would actually break Republican, and then the Secretary of State would break Democrat. Everything else would be Republican except for the Secretary of State, because independents made the calculation that I would actually trust Democrats more than Republicans.
What states?
Running our election state. I believe this was it was either Arizona or Nevada, where you would see a tangible 2 to 3 to 4% difference in the Secretary of State results compared to the gubernatorial results, which means that there were people who voted for a Republican, say, education education, whatever, but then wouldn't vote for a Republican Secretary of State, meaning it's having a tangible impact on how Americans choose who run our election systems. And you can look at the endorsements that were made going into this. I think I have this written down somewhere here. The American First Secretary of State Coalition, the most prominent group supporting election deniers to oversee the state elections, lists 17 endorsements on his website. 16 lost on election night. In May, the Washington Post wrote an article about the 9 races where these people could win and have a significant influence on the certification of the vote. This includes Carrie Lake, March Fitchman, Doug Mastriano. Every single one of those people lost. I think Republicans kind of look a little bitchy. They kind of look a little whiny when it comes to talking about 2020. And Americans hate sore losers. We love winners, but we especially hate sore losers. And I think that's how the Republican Party is coming off. And I think it had a toxic effect on their results. Blake Masters on the campaign trail said that Donald Trump won the election. And I think that had an impact, considering he's going to be a senator from a state that is going to have a significant impact on who's president in 2024. Same with Carrie Lake and same with Mark Fitchman.
You did no. I believe it or not, I tend to agree with you. In that, like abortion, it's very plausible and seems likely that it did occur, that the issue salience around quote unquote democracy, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, but just as shorthand, democracy issues, as Democrats label them, that was successfully employed probably in some jurisdictions as a turnout motivator, which is why I think you saw, Obama, when he was deployed to these states in the final week or two of the campaign, that was more or less what he devoted his entire speeches to. Biden did that national address that some people thought was clunky and maybe inopportune when I think it was the Thursday before the election, it was dedicated to these quote unquote democracy issues. As a base motivator, that probably was effective for Democrats in certain respects. I don't deny that. I actually think that, especially if a congressional candidate or a Secretary of State candidate or gubernatorial candidate or whomever at any level of government, the closer they could be tied to Trump, right, the more likely that the anti-Trump forces that impelled Democratic overperformance in 2018, the more that those forces could be harnessed again, right? To galvanize those Democratic partisans from an anti-Trump standpoint, right? Because you're almost voting against Trump by proxy if you're voting against some of these candidates who are more seem to be more aligned with him, whether it's on the 2020 election or just more broadly like the MAGA packaging. Just from like a more objective analytical standpoint in terms of how that issue affected various races, I don't really disagree with you much. But on the substantive point, I do disagree. Because I just want to clarify, when I bring up Hillary Clinton, and I know it's tedious, I know Hillary's not been a national figure of immediate concern for a while. I'm aware that Republicans overdid the "what about Hillary" thing. And her emails and that and so forth. But however, if we're going to define election denier, the term election denier, as one who's cast doubt on the veracity of election outcome, I'm sorry, but it applies to Hillary Clinton. And let me just finish. And I agree with you that what Hillary Clinton and Democrats did post 2016 is not the same as what Republicans and Trump did post 2020. There are significant differences. I'm not equating them or saying that they ought to be viewed in exactly the same light. I'm simply observing that if we go by the 2022 definition of who's an election denier, retroactively, it would have to apply to a whole bevy of prominent Democrats, not just Hillary Clinton. John Lewis went on Meet the Press the Sunday before Trump's inauguration, declared he was boycotting it because he said that there was a conspiracy by Russia to install Trump in power, and he didn't think that Trump was legitimately elected. Everybody from Elizabeth Warren to Nancy Pelosi to Chuck Schumer, the leading lights of the party, okay, they said throughout 2017, 2018, that Russia hacked the election. They didn't make a distinction between light interference with social media bots and other kinds of hacking. They said hacked the election, which then led supermajorities of Democrats, according to contemporaneous polling, I could send you the links if you want, As late as 2018, 2019, supermajorities of Democrats said not just that Russia, quote, interfered with some Facebook memes in the election in 2016, but that Russia directly tampered with the vote totals and illicitly installed Trump into power. Now, that does cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2016 election outcome. So, again, granting that what the Republicans did and what Democrats did in these different contexts are not the same, and I'm not equating them. I'm simply extracting what this new definition is supposedly is of election denier and noting that if it actually were applied impartially and it wasn't just this partisan propaganda cudgel, it would have to be applied to Democrats. And because it's not, that's pretty clear proof that it is just this partisan propaganda term. It's an effective term, probably, or possibly, in certain contexts, but still, on the substance, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Can I respond to this in a way? This to me feels kind of like, you know how the word racist is used a lot, and a lot of times it's used in a way that it shouldn't probably be used, and it's used in situations that are inappropriate. Like when it comes to the term racist, let's say somebody said something like, I don't know, like they use the term Oriental. That could be construed as racist, correct? Right? But to me, this is like saying like, oh, that person's racist. Compare, and then I point over there, and somebody's over there making a speech about how the Japanese like their skull shapes and getting into like some weird racist shit. To me, that's what it feels like we're comparing when we're talking about like John Lewis versus Donald Trump, Blake Masters, and these comparisons. What it is true that it's bad that John Lewis said that. I don't like what Stacey Abrams said.
Is he an election denier?
I would say yes. I would say that when we compare the
you're consistent then. I applaud you.
Thank you. I appreciate. Can I get an applause? Thank you very much. I would say that while it is true that they engage in that behavior, the effects of that behavior is very different, and the lengths they went to engage in that behavior are different. For example, Hillary Clinton, she ended up conceding the election. Stacey Abrams, she just conceded the election. Carrie Lake, is she conceding the election? This is the problem I have. It's like when we compare people like Carrie Lake and Donald Trump to people like Hillary Clinton and Stacey Abrams, the impact they have on our democracy and exactly how far they take this stuff is different. So if you're like just voting on like protecting our democracy from people who would seek to just change the results if they lose, you would vote Democrat going into this election if that was your primary issue, considering the fact who was most likely to be the Republican nominee in 2024 and who was the Republican nominee in 2020 has not accepted his loss still and is still pushing nonsense about the election and tried to intimidate the Secretary of State of Georgia to just get him the votes. Just quite frank, just literally actually trying to fuck with the vote tally. What some Democrats, I wouldn't say the majority, what a minority of Democrats said crazy shit about like Russia manipulating the votes.
Not a minority, a clear majority.
I guess I'm talking about majority of elected Democrats.
No, that's what I'm talking about.
You would say a clear majority of elected Democrats think that Donald Trump was not the legitimate president of the United States? I would. A
clear majority of elected Democrats spoke about the so-called Russian interference issue in the 2016 election in terms that, going by this current definition of election denier, would make them an election denier because they plainly cast doubt on the veracity of the outcome of the 2016 election. That's what we're told now is the definition.
When you say that's what we're told now, are you saying like one news organization said this or the government?
Oh, I just gave you one. I gave you one example. That's the very common definition used across the media.
I'm losing my train of thought. I think I might have just lost it.
Fuck. We can move on.
Well, no, I'd like to finish my train of thought.
Okay. I thought you just wanted a segue to move on.
We're not getting off this train. I wanted to finish it. Okay. What was it? God damn it. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is if you're somebody who cares about democracy and you're voting this election and your primary issue is that, one party is much more clearly willing to respect the outcomes of the election and not act against trying to counteract it and change those results once they get a result that they don't like. And there are certain people like Carrie Lake and like Donald Trump who, given the opportunity, I'm not so sure that they wouldn't try to do that. And in fact, we've seen Donald Trump try to engage in that behavior himself. And so I do think that Donald Trump's behavior is a unique threat to democracy that you just cannot compare to, say, you can't compare it to Stacey Abrams or Hillary Clinton or John Lewis. And so the democracy vote this election, I do think, went pro-Democrat. And that's why I think Secretary of States performed better, Democratic Secretary of State candidates.
Okay, but again, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to utter the words Hillary Clinton. But when Hillary Clinton says, as she did all throughout Trump's tenure, that the election was stolen from her, that Trump was illegitimately elected, and that there are lots of doubts still circulating about whether the election itself was above the level, on the level. That's what she said, 2019 quote, look it up. She was casting doubt on the veracity of the election outcome in 2016. Was Hillary Clinton an election denier?
Yes.
Okay, so but you'll grant that.
Yeah, I just don't think she's a threat.
Election denier is not a term that's ever applied to Hillary Clinton in these common discourses around the whole concept.
Let me tell you, the reason why is because Hillary Clinton isn't going to run for president again, and the lengths that she went to in denying the election is not the same lengths that Donald Trump went to in talking about this election.
And I'm not saying
it's like for example, it's like when people try to compare Joe Biden and Donald Trump's racism. It's like, yeah, Joe Biden said some very problematic things about like if you don't vote for me, you ain't black and stuff like that. You can't compare that to I'm calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what the hell's going on. Again, these are both things deserving of criticism, but one thing is much more severe, and that's why I think it broke pro-Democrat to be pro-democracy this election.
And again, I'm not comparing Democratic behavior on this and Republican behavior on this so as to equate the two. I've been pretty clear about that. I'm not making a comparison in that sense. I'm kind of examining both on their own terms, and on their own terms, Democrats engaged clearly in behavior that, as of today's definition, would qualify them as so-called election deniers. Now, I genuinely do applaud you for being consistent, much more consistent than most on this issue, because you just acknowledged that, John Lewis, Hillary Clinton are election deniers. I could give you countless other examples right now, but we don't want to spend all night on it. I would just say, how do you think it would be received if you if it were claimed, if you said in the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC or Democratic leaning media Twitter or even NAFO Twitter or any place online or in the media sphere that's kind of roughly Democratic friendly, how do you think it would be interpreted if you said, gee, Hillary Clinton is actually also an election denier? Do you think that would be just accepted? I don't think so. And it wouldn't be accepted because that was not, because to make that concession detracts from the propaganda value of that term, which is all about making out Republicans to be this uniquely apocalyptic threat in terms of their attitudes toward.
Would you agree with me that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy?
A unique threat to democracy? I think Trump has
the actions he takes is different from the actions other political figures would take in his position, and that is very unique. Who else would have wrote up an executive order to seize voting machines? Like, that shit's insane.
That's just trivially correct, right? Because literally no other president did what Trump did in the aftermath of an election and tried to, organize a rally at the Capitol and everything that went on, right? So that's just factually and almost trivially correct. That Trump engages in activities and behaviors that are distinct to him. Of course, yes.
But that's why I think more of these of the election denial stuff is thrown as Republicans, is because their candidate has been shown themselves to be, I think, the much clearer threat to the democratic system in the United States.
Okay, but if you were invited on CNN tonight and you repeated what you just said 10 minutes, 5 minutes ago, that
I've said this before.
Hillary Clinton's also an election denier. How do you think you would be received on CNN?
I don't know. Maybe they would avoid it and they would just move on. But I don't think it's the thing that their hosts would love to hear. I don't think they would lash out at me. But the problem is if I say that, it depends on whether or not people take that to mean like Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, they're like basically the same. They both deny elections. And I'm like because it sounds like I'm trying to apologize for Trump's behavior, which we both agree is much, much, much worse than anything Hillary did, anything
it's of a different nature. It's of a different order.
Well, would you agree with me that it's much worse to like call up a Secretary of State and just ask them to get you the votes to win than like after the fact being like, oh, fucking, I should have been the winner?
I think Trump is definitely a lot more brazen on these things than his, Democratic contemporaries. That's for sure. But, I do think that Democratic Party attitudes toward the 2016 election and the way that kind of coincided with these unprecedented interventions by the security state apparatus and electoral politics, and then even in the ability of the incumbent president at that point, Trump, to conduct policy affairs. There are a lot of maybe undesirable effects of how their posture shook out as well. So again, I'm not equating them. I'm not making. I know what you mean in that if you made the Hillary Clinton as an election denier statement on CNN, it would automatically be interpreted as, oh, you're doing a false equivalence between Trump and Hillary, even though you didn't assert any equivalence. I mean, that's a common thing online, right? Where people are angry that you said something that you didn't say, but they invented in their head that you said and then applied to you, even though it only exists in their own head.
I think if I gave the context that Hillary Clinton did deny the results of the election and she shouldn't, but what Donald Trump did is incomparable to what Hillary Clinton did.
It's of a different order. I agree with that,
and it was a much bigger threat.
I agree. It was of a wholly different order and.
Can you agree with me that it was a much bigger threat?
A threat. I mean, I think the threat. I mean, I do think the rhetoric around the supposedly apocalyptic threat posed by Trump and Republicans, where we're constantly being told that we're always teetering on the brink of total democratic collapse, like the government was on the verge of supposedly being overthrown in a coup on January 6th, which is like ludicrous. You have
I don't know if we're told
you have these
that.
like existentialist stakes that I think are fallaciously applied to Republican attitudes toward election administration. So I'm wary of like signing on to that threat inflation, which I think is kind of vastly overdone. That said, yes, okay. I agree with you that Trump and Republicans are of what they have done is of a different nature entirely than to what the Democrats
let me isolate it there, because I want to make sure, I want to get a strong answer to this. If we were to compare Hillary Clinton saying Donald Trump was the illegitimate president after the election in like 2018, 2019, whenever she said it, and let's compare that to Donald Trump calling the Secretary of State and asking him, and threatening him, to be quite frank, threatening him to get him the votes necessary for him to win the election because he was down in the votes. What thing is worse?
I'm not trying to dodge the question at all. I just need a little bit of a prelude to answer it. Okay, so I wouldn't make a one-on-one comparison between those two statements, because when Hillary says that Trump is not the legitimate president in 2019, that's also coupled with a whole campaign among the partisan Democratic infrastructure that Hillary has a huge amount of influence over still, even when she loses, that involves the security state apparatus, FBI, NSA, CIA, to intervene in domestic political affairs on the same sort of logic that Hillary propounds in that one comment in 2019, et cetera, that the huge excesses to the point of ad nauseum on the part of the media in kind of fomenting this hysteria around Trump being a sort of Manchurian candidate who had been illegitimately installed into power by Putin. All of that kind of can't be really disentangled from the one manifestation of this whole narrative in 2019 when Hillary makes her statement about Trump not being illegitimate, because that's why she said it, right? That's why she said that comment. So now, of course, Trump making the phone call to Raffensperger and saying, hey, can you find me however many votes? That's also the culmination of a certain narrative around the 2020 election that he and other Republicans were advancing. So when you say what is worse, it's hard for me to say. I actually do think there are some pretty damning implications of how Democrats approached the whole 2016 election issue. I think it was pretty, I think it hardened foreign policy attitudes within the Democratic professional class. This idea that Trump was illicitly installed into power by Putin and therefore vengeance was needed against Putin, that basically caused the Democrats to en masse just jettison Obama-era policies around diplomatic and military and economic relations with Russia because they were so radicalized on this Trump, Manchurian candidate issue. So when you're asking me what is worse, I think there are things to say about what Trump did post-2020 election, including in that phone call, that on their own terms warrant scrutiny and even condemnation, perhaps in certain senses. Perhaps. And a similar argument can be made for Democrats on the whole Russia issue involving the 2016 election, which they used incessantly to foment doubt in the legitimacy of that particular election outcome, and then leveraged it to achieve certain policy outcomes during the Trump administration, particularly around foreign policy, that I tend to think were not the most felicitous, let's say.
So I guess for me, this is like a really easy like question. For me, it's very easy to say like what Donald Trump did in that call is 10 times worse than anything any comparable Democrat has done. And the reason why is, one, when you're talking about after the fact and trying to find out whatever fairy tale you want to classify why you lost an election, you know, when you're doing that, that's bad if you start lying about what happened or misrepresenting what happened to explain your loss to your base. So maybe you don't have to make any reforms, or you can explain it away on how it's not your fault. And I think that's a lot of what motivated Hillary Clinton, even though the Russians did attempt to affect American public opinion and pump up extremists and like the spreading of misinformation and stuff like that. They didn't change any of the votes. But the difference between complaining after the fact about like, oh, these fucking Russians, and actively trying to steal an election, which is what Donald Trump was trying to do in that call, I think it's pretty clear to anybody who's watching it without like an extremely pro-Trump bias. I think this is different. I think it's markedly different, because it's Donald Trump obviously like actively saying, hey, I will steal an election and I will steal our democracy if you give us the chance. And in fact, he has from the beginning been pretty open about this. In 2015, he said, if I lose any of these races, it's rigged. He said the same thing in 2016, and he said the same thing in the lead up to 2020. He has always primed his audience to be ready to like get in the trenches and follow through with what he was attempting to do, which is basically say, we lost, this is mine. And that's what he attempted to do. I would say that attempting to steal an election is different and more severely bad than actually like talking about, well, I lost because of the Russians. I think these are two totally different things, and one is an ever-present threat to democracy. That's why I'm actually willing to point at that and say it's much worse.
Okay. Well, I spent years on end, pretty much without interruption, covering a whole variety, an endless variety of dimensions of the whole Russiagate, you know, quote unquote, matter, as pertains to, you know, the domestic political effect, where, you know, I would go to town hall meetings throughout 2017, we know when the resistance was really ramping up, and it would be the number one issue that was being, you know, screamed about literally by Democratic partisans and activists, where they were convinced of the most maximalist version of the Trump-Russia theory, where they literally thought that, you know, Trump was conspiratorially forged a conspiratorial pact with Putin to be installed into office and be, you know, illegitimately put into the presidency, and that Putin was controlling the government effectively. That was sincerely believed, and you can downplay it. I'm not addressing you personally, but anyone who downplays that, I think, is sort of memory holing a lot of what generally went on. I personally covered a great deal of it in person myself. So the whole object there, the whole point of that narrative, which was 24/7, 365 for like 3 years, was expressly to foment doubt in the outcome of the 2016 election, because the whole idea was that Trump illegitimately won that election by virtue of his collusive, illicit arrangement with Putin. Okay? That was 24/7, totally dominating the media for years. And I do think that there are lots of maybe underappreciated deleterious effects of that narrative in a variety of domains, on the foreign policy front, on the domestic front, just in that it made a lot of people crazed. It made a lot of people delusional as to the nature of their government and society. It got people hugely emotionally kind of exercised to the point of like mental instability over Trump, which I don't think is healthy. Not that I'm defending Trump or I would have voted for Trump, which I didn't. But, you know, even if you oppose a political figure, it's best to do so on rational grounds rather than confabulated grounds. Who did I vote for? I've abstained from the past couple presidential elections. Last time I voted in a presidential election was actually the first one I was eligible for. It was Obama in 2008. And I volunteered on the Obama campaign. I went to New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and all over the place. So that was pre-media days for me. But that's last time I voted in a presidential election. Since then, I've abstained for a variety of reasons, and actually because I try to be transparent. to the best of my ability. I usually put out a little explanation for my own thinking on that, on my own voting choice, around elections, so people can read it and see if they agree or don't. But yeah, that's what I've done.
We can maybe, I don't want to hold you up here all day, so would you be willing to reschedule another talk so we can talk about voting? And
yeah, sure.
Because I almost certainly disagree with the idea that anybody shouldn't vote in an election. I think everybody should vote.